Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dan. Impromptu or not, well done. Really do appreciate it. It's great to see everyone here today. I've said before, and I'm going to probably repeat it throughout the year, we're not following any particular sermon series structure this year, which is very freeing in some capacity. Before we would do sermon series, that would be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. We did the story, which was 31 weeks. And it's kind of nice to just be free to quickly move between topics and address situations as they arise. But it also gives me a little bit more time to just contemplate certain topics, and then when I'm ready to talk about it, I can. And so today's topic, it's, you can see it there on the screen, comfort or abandonment. But it really, it's going to be a series of messages that are going to be loosely connected, and they're not necessarily going to be back to back. It's going to kind of be a theme, I think, that recurs throughout the year. So it's just be something to be watching out for. But I've kind of been on a journey since I haven't been so focused on, preparing these 6 or 8 or 12 messages for a particular series. I've been on a journey studying through the life of Jesus this year, reading the Gospels through, and I'm going to be rereading through them throughout the year. And as I do, I've been struck by 2 questions that keep coming back to my mind. And the first question is, who is Jesus in my life? Who is Jesus in my life? Now, I want you to ask that question of yourself. If you were going to give Jesus a title for who he is in your life, what might that title be? And I'm going to ask you to shout out some answers. Now, this may not be your title that you would give him for your life. Maybe it's a title that you've heard people say, you've heard sermons about it, or whatever, you've heard songs, whatever. But if you were going to say Jesus has a title for his role in your life, what might that title be?
King of Kings.
Oh, King of Kings.
Friend.
Love.
Comforter. Love. Yes, absolutely. Those are good titles. And as I go through the Bible, I can support every single one of those titles, and he is appropriately every one of them. But all of them by themselves are not sufficient to describe his role in your life. In fact, there is only one title that Jesus needs to have in your life, and all the others fall into place. It's the title of Lord. Either he is Lord of your whole life, or he's Lord of nothing in your life. And that's really bothered me, because I've done some real honest assessment of my life for the past several months. And you know what I've discovered? I found Jesus has been Lord of some of my life. In fact, I would go as far as to say I think he's been Lord of most of my life, but he's not been Lord of all of my life. There's been some areas of my life I've been resistant. Not that I've intentionally said, Jesus, you stay away. I don't want you to touch this. It's just been some areas that I've been pushing and pulling at, that I've been fighting against. And I'm like, I know this is what you would probably prefer, but this is what I would prefer. And when you have a Lord-slave relationship, there's no give and take. The Lord sets the standard, the slave follows. Now, we don't like that term slave. Of course, our culture has really been embattled with the idea of racism and then slavery and the country's history with it. And, those are all worthy discussions to have at some point. But we can't neuter the Bible any longer to avoid offending sensibilities of modern culture. We just got to say what is said and quit apologizing for it. And what the Bible tells us is Jesus is Lord, and we are to be his slave. Now, a lot of the newer translations, they like to soften it, so they put servant. You should be the servant of all. You go to the root word, it's not servant, it's slave. And when you have a slave-master relationship, it's very different than if you have a servant-master relationship. For example, if you have a servant-master relationship, the servant might say, hey, my pay is not good enough. I'd like to see a raise. Or, hey, the working conditions are terrible. The food you're providing isn't good enough. I don't have enough days off. You need to do something about this, because if not, I quit. Not too many slaves get a chance to negotiate like that on their own behalf. I don't like this. Okay, you got it. You know what? It's not so bad after all. And that's really it with a slave-master relationship. And so the question becomes, is Jesus truly Lord of my life? And am I following him as a slave? That's really something I've been wrestling with, and I hope it's something you will start evaluating your own life on as well. But then the second question that I've really been kind of going through is, what is Jesus calling me to do? And until you resolve the first question, the second question, you're not going to get where you need to be. Until Jesus is Lord over your whole life, you're never going to follow him to do what he's calling you to do. Not completely. Not completely. And so you got to resolve these questions in order. is Jesus Lord of all? If not, then go through that. Then after you figure that part out, what is he calling me to do? Now there's the generic will of God's call. The generic will of God's call is that we should love God, love people, teach the truth. We can go through all those things. That's for everybody. But then there's his specific will for your life. And that specific will, it could be, he's calling you to be a missionary overseas, or he's calling you to be generous to people in need, or he's calling you to, fill in the blank. You get the idea. But until you get that first question figured out, you're never going to get to the second question properly. You'll never do exactly what Jesus is wanting you to do if you are not completely sold out to him as Lord of your life. And that's really where we're getting to the heart of today's message. And so I hope you'll join me as I start going through a series of thoughts this morning. You'll notice there's no actual outline in your bulletin. It's because I put these thoughts together in what I think is a cohesive setup. But I just want you to take notes as things stand out to you and what's important to you. I think you should jot down those two questions, though, if you are going to write anything down. Who is Jesus in my life, and what is he calling me to do? But the question I want to ask now is, if I was to ask you to define success in the church, how would you define it? If I was to ask you to define success in the church, how would you define it? So start putting it through your brain here, and I'll have a little participation with you here, and I want to hear what you have to say. And so start thinking about it. If I was going to tell you, I want you to list for me how I can determine if this church is successful and this church is not, what would you use to determine if a church is successful? Give me something. You've never thought about it before. Okay.
Outreach.
What's that?
Outreach.
Outreach. Okay, that's reaching its community. Absolutely. That's a good one. Yeah. Attendance. Hey. They say numbers don't lie,
Fellowship.
Fellowship. The connectedness within the church body. Yes. Sharing. Very good. Absolutely. Okay. So those are some good thoughts. If you were to go to a ministry conference, we've been to so many of these over all the years, it seems like everything centers around a few key things. One is attendance. What's your average attendance? And numbers alone, of course, can't tell you if a church is successful. You say, well, this church runs, 50 people. Well, that's not successful. Well, last year they were running 40 people. Oh, they've increased. Okay. So a church that's running, that church is running 1,000. Yeah, but the year before they were running 2,000. So, they've had a decrease. So numbers can be a sign of success, but I think an increase of numbers we would always say is a success. Or how about giving? You say, well, we brought in 75% of the budget this year. Bummer. But now we're on track to bring in 80% of the budget. That's even better. I mean, that's not true in our particular case, but that's just an example that you might use. Or we brought in 110% of the budget, and our expenses were less than budget. We're in the black and not the red. That's wonderful. We might say that church is successful. Or we might look at midweek programming. I think the last statistic I heard, pre-COVID, was that if you had about 30% of your church show up for the midweek activities, that was considered good. 30% was good. When we were going strong with Power Hour, my goodness, we were running 50, 60, and sometimes upper 70% of attendance on Wednesdays as well as Sundays. I mean, it was a phenomenal turnout. And so we might say our midweek programming was successful. But ultimately, do you notice what all those things have in common? Numbers, money. Yes, it's something you can tangibly write down and measure. All those measurements of success have to do with numbers. Now, here's what's really interesting. Our model in the Bible is Jesus. The person we're trying to mold ourselves after, the person we're trying to be like, is Jesus. And he did some really interesting thing with numbers. In fact, if you go to the Gospel of John, he feeds the 5,000 early on, and he, big crowd, there's some 15,000 people that show up between the men, women, and children, and they come back the next day looking for food. Jesus says, you're looking for another free meal. And the people are like, yeah, we had fish and bread yesterday, we're hoping for biscuits and gravy today. And, I'd show up. And so Jesus says, but instead I'm going to preach to you. And unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. Now, we get really down on these people. We start saying, they start to grumble, and it says, this is a hard teaching, who can understand it? They begin to walk away. And we get really mad at them, like, what's their problem? They weren't truly committed. Listen, they never heard that before. They never heard this phrase, eat flesh and drink blood. We know it because we lived 2,000 years later. We've done the study. We know he's talking about communion and the sacrifice. They didn't get it. So many people, and I hear say all the time, I just wish I lived when Jesus did, then I'd believe. Most of them didn't believe him. In fact, Jesus took a crowd of thousands. He took them down to the 12, and then he asked them, are you going to leave me too? Sounds very different from what we call success. And at the end of Jesus' ministry, after 3 years, I've tried to figure the numbers. I'm going to guess, just in a ballpark way, Jesus had to preach to over 100,000 people in his lifetime. And I say that because he fed the 5,000, and so we figure that's about 15,000 when you figure in everybody. He fed the 4,000, there's another 10 to 12,000, and that's just 2 very brief moments of his life where we're already into the 20, maybe 30,000 range. And he preached for 3 years. So I think safely we could say 100,000 people heard him preach. And at the end of his ministry, he had about 120 people who were committed to follow him, and out of the 120, he had 12 that were close, and one of them betrayed him. That's a very different measure of success. But what happened out of that is Jesus took these 120 committed followers and he changed the entire direction of the world. That's what's really cool. Jesus refused to compromise. Jesus refused to say what was popular or would make people feel comfortable in order to gain a crowd. He wasn't interested in that. He wanted dedicated people who would follow him, and it would make all the difference in a messed up world. And you think our world's messed up today? It was messed up in Jesus' day. And the Christians made the difference. And the Christians weren't the thousands who followed. It was the 120 committed who began to change the world. And that is still the truth that is true for our world today. You say, I don't know where America's headed. Well, I don't know where it's headed either. And my biggest concern about where it's headed is where the Christians are headed. Are the Christians truly committed to the call of Jesus? And I have some concerns about that. Part of my concern is based on attendance. Now, this isn't about our church specifically, but I do want to point out a national trend. If we would, this is a true statistic, it comes from Stephen Below at the O'Fallon Christian Church. He did the research, and I appreciate his effort to do it. But if we say pre-COVID, church attendance was at 100%. As our baseline number. That's 100% of people at church on a regular basis before COVID. Where are we a year later? How many have returned to church? Well, in person, we have about, nationally, 37% of people have returned to in-person worship services. So there's 63% of people hanging out there. Now, some people are online, and that's a given. Some people are, have passed away. I mean, of course, that was a COVID as well as other issues. Other challenges still happen. Some people have had a lifestyle change where maybe they're in a nursing home or they're unable to get out of their home, so they can't return. But how many people is that truly affecting on a percentage scale? I mean, it's got to be less than 1%. If you're being real honest with it, let's give it 2% just to be exceedingly generous. So 61% of people have still not returned to in-person worship from a year ago to where we are today. And that bothers me. Now, we've done better here, statistically, percentage-wise. We're doing a lot better than 37%, which I'm so grateful for. And actually, most churches, I think, in the Bible Belt are doing better, and you would expect it. But you especially would think in the more difficult areas where churches have had a harder time gaining a foothold in cultures that embrace values that contradict the Bible, it's not been as pleasant for them. Their numbers are quite decreased, and many churches have, quite frankly, had to close their doors completely. And why is that? What is going on? What's going on is people are starting to embrace comfort instead of total abandonment to Jesus. People are finding that, well, church was nice, but maybe it wasn't as important as I thought it was, or I can watch it online at home just as good as I can in person. Look, if you can't be in person, it's a great option. But if you have the choice to be in person, it's always better. But Jesus refused to compromise. Jesus refused to say what was acceptable to make people happy. He was willing for people to walk away than for them to show up for a lie. And that's where we have a collision course with the American church today. I think our American church, and I'm just saying generically, the churches in America, they're changing the message to make it more palatable, to make it more welcoming, to make it easier for people to show up. Well, I think making it easy to show up is fine. But if you keep them with a lie, then you're not doing anybody any service. Because when the real teaching shows up, and we deal with the eat my flesh and drink my blood speeches, they're going to walk away. They will have been there for a false reason. Now, I've been reading David Platt's book, Radical, the past few weeks, and that's kind of what's inspired some of what I'm saying today. I don't agree with everything he says in the book, so if you say, "Ooh, I want to pick that book up and read it," you're welcome to do it. I think he has a lot of good observations I like. Like I said, I don't agree with everything, and just as a side note, I found reading is much more enjoyable when you can disagree with the author, unless it's the Bible, as Mike pointed out. It's a wonderful thing. But David Platt talked about this journey he was on, about realizing that what the church stood for and what the Bible stood for weren't lining up at times. He was faced with two questions. The first was this: was I going to believe Jesus? Was I going to embrace Jesus even though he said radical things that drove the crowds away? The second question was more challenging. Was I going to obey Jesus? My biggest fear even now is that I will hear Jesus' words and walk away content to settle for less than radical obedience to him. And that is my fear. Part of my fear today is that you're going to say, wow, I want to get more committed. I want to be more abandoned to myself and focus on Jesus, and I want to be less comfortable in just my daily life so I can be more focused on Jesus. But how long is that going to last? Is it going to last 2 weeks? Is it going to last a month? Is it going to get you to lunch today, where the conversation maybe will stop and it never is brought up again? So it's very tempting that we get caught up in the emotion of the moment. But if there's no follow-through, what good did it do you? So those are the questions that we have to come to terms with. So let me tell you a story, true story, 100% true story, about a church in Asia. It's a small building. It's not an actual church, it's a hut. And it has a roof with a single light hanging in the middle, and it has a dirt floor. And in this hut, 12 leaders from various small villages have gathered to encourage one another and to study the Bible. But they arrived at different times. See, some arrived early in the morning, some arrived in the late afternoon. Over the course of several hours, covering several miles from all different directions, they showed up. And they staggered their times on purpose, because a meeting like this is illegal in the country where they live. And so they get together and they share the difficulty of what's going through their life. And what is going through their life? Well, there's a cult that has risen up in one of these countries, and they're capturing Christians, and they're cutting out their tongues. Because if they cut out their tongues, they can't talk about Jesus. It's also a deterrent for people who aren't that serious to say, you know what, not for me, I'll stick with Buddha or whatever God is prominent in their country. Others talked about how they've been fined, they've been imprisoned, they've been ostracized from their community, meaning they can't do business. So food is hard to come by, basic necessities are hard to come by, and others have even had people die for their faith. And as they share what's going on in their life, they bow down in prayer, crying out to God for help. And when they rise up from their prayer, there is a literal puddle of tears in the dirt. It has formed a puddle. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I prayed so hard that I cried that a puddle would form. That I prayed so committed to a task, a call, so emotionally moved about a situation that it brought me to that kind of tears. I bet you might be able to think of a moment at some point. But how recent was it? And was it only involved in dealing with a sickness or an illness? Was it only involved in dealing with the recovery from an accident or a tragedy? When was the last time we were moved about a faith issue to that type of tears or emotion? I'm not saying we need to be emotional all the time. That's coming from the guy who, not very emotional. I'm not wired that way. But it does give me pause. And it makes me just at least consider that maybe I need to be a little bit more serious and a little bit more invested in what I'm praying about. But I want to read to you a story about two teenagers David writes about. Teenagers like Shan and Lane, who've been sent out from house churches in their villages to undergo intensive study and preparation for taking the gospel to parts of Asia where there are no churches. Lane said to me, "I've told my family that I will likely never come back home. I'm going to hard places to make the gospel known, and it's possible that I will lose my life in the process." Shan added, "But our families understand. Our mom and dads have been in prison for their faith, and they've taught us that Jesus is worthy of all our devotion." Now, let's go back to pretend play. Let's pretend you're a teenager. Some of you all don't have to pretend, and that's fine too. But let's pretend that you're a teenager. You go to your parents and say, "Look, I think God is calling me to do the 6-month intensive study program, and then I want to go preach the gospel where people don't know Jesus, but it's a hostile environment. I'll probably never come home because I'm probably going to die, but to make Jesus known, it's worth it." How many of your parents would have said, "Go get it. right up front without any questions asked. Would y'all send that to me? They paused. They didn't answer. So there's the thought right there. I mean, that's seriously true. I mean, we're all like, really? There's this awesome church in Missouri. You're going to love it. And the people are nice. They're going to welcome you. Your needs are going to be met. Don't you really want to go there instead? You even get a potluck once in a while. Life is good. I mean, surely that's what you would rather do. Now imagine your child coming up to you and saying that to you. What are you going to say? Well, first of all, it depends. How have they been acting that day? This sounds like an excellent idea. Go away. But I mean, seriously, if your child comes to you and says, I want to go do this and I'm probably going to die and I'll never see you again, are you just going to immediately agree with them? Or are you at least going to say, I need a minute to think about this? I think, if we're being honest, everybody pauses at minimum. Pauses at a minimum. And takes a little while to at least come to terms with what has been said. And of course, you want to make sure they're making a decision that they're going to follow through on, and they're not emotional in the moment, and 3 months later they drop out. I get that. But do you notice what Shannon Ling said? Our parents understand. They said Jesus is worthy of all our devotion. But the moment we pause and say, ooh, that's pretty high cost. We've already shown people that our idea of faith is it has limits. Our idea of devotion to Jesus has a cutoff point. But in other countries where it's illegal to be a Christian, those cutoff points don't exist. You follow Jesus or you don't. Who is Jesus in my life? To them, he's Lord. And there's no one else. I think too often we worship at the idea of a long life, a full life, a safe life, a life of possessions, a life of the American dream. And if you can accumulate that stuff and honor God at the same time, I think it's wonderful. But I think if we're real honest, that's a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge where we can get too wrapped up in this life. Popular preacher wrote a book that said, live your best life now. For the Christian, there's no such thing. It's your best life yet to come. And if that life is truly as good as Jesus says it is, then it's worth losing your life in this life for him. That's the reality. Are we chasing comfort or are we chasing abandonment? I can't answer that for you. Only you can answer that for you. I'm just trying to give you the pieces necessary to evaluate your life. Here, tell you another story. I met an elderly man a couple weeks ago. First time I'd ever met him. Nice guy, talked really good to me. And he was telling me about two of his sons. I think he only has two sons. He only talked about two of them. And he said one of them is in the police department and rising through the ranks, doing really well. The other one is a junior CEO making a 6-figure salary, doing really well. I'm like, oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear it. And he's like, but they don't care about God. In fact, I don't think they give God any thought at all. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. And so we had a conversation about it. And he said, I'm not only concerned about them, but my grandkids. They're being raised in this environment where they don't care about God. Are they ever going to care about God? And he's really concerned about where their life is headed. And I told him I pray for him, and I have. And you don't need to know his name in order to pray for him. So I hope you might add him to your prayer list and his family as he tries to be that positive influence. But I have to admit, after I left, and I've been thinking about this conversation for a couple weeks now, there's one question I keep coming back to. And that is, what would it take for him to say, oh, good, I'm glad they are here now? What would it take for him to say, oh, good, I'm glad they're committed to Jesus now? Would it take church attendance, like half the time? Would he be thrilled with that? Oh, it's half the time, thank goodness, better than nothing. Well, I guess. Or what about every Sunday? Would that be enough? Or how about if they prayed before meals? What if they read their Bible a couple days a week? What if they started giving some of their income, 1%, 5%, 10% to the church? Would that be enough? At what point would he say, whew, I don't have to worry about that anymore? And the point I'm trying to make here is so often we tie our level of faith to the level of things that we're doing. We're tying our level of commitment to Jesus to the things that we do. And trust me, I think that church attendance is important. I think we've been talking about that for a few weeks. I think reading your Bible is important, and praying is important, and giving is important. I think that's all part of it. But at some point, I think we're worshiping the checklist to say, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, I'm good. But Jesus, I just read this in the Gospel of Luke yesterday. He makes this really strong statement. And it's like back in chapter 13 or 14, somewhere in that neighborhood. And the disciples asked the question, and it's amazing that they picked up on this. They said, will only a few be saved? Wow, what a great question to ask. And Jesus says, I'll tell you that there will be those who come knocking on the door, and I will say, away from me, I never knew you. They say, oh, but we know you. We went to church. We socialized with you. We knew you. We called on your name. And they say, away from me, I never knew you. And of course, in Matthew, it gets even stronger. It says that they not only they drove out demons, they prophesied in his name. They did all these things that made them look like they were truly committed to Jesus. And Jesus is going to say, away from me, I never knew you. So we have to be cautious that we don't base our Christian success on the checklist. I think at some point we start worshiping the checklist. I do enough religious things, I'm good. It's not going to cut it anymore. We have to be completely sold out to Jesus, and that should impact our prayer life, our Bible reading, our giving, and all the other commitments. That's all part of it. But we just have to make a determination. Is it because we love Jesus and He is our Lord? Or is it because we love the checklist and we can say we are successful as a result? David Platt was in that hut with those 20 church leaders on that dirt floor. 3 weeks later, he started his first Sunday as the senior minister of a large church here in the southern U.S. And it was a church of thousands. And they called him the youngest megachurch pastor in America. He said he didn't like that title at all, but it was written in a newspaper, so it's what it was. He said that Sunday began very differently from that day in the hut. Large parking lot, millions of dollars worth of cars all pulling in. Outside there were large bouncy houses for the kids to play in. Inside, air conditioning on a hot day, padded chairs, a brightly lit stage, a band that could play for the radio. And then people wanted to hear the new preacher and hope he was good. And he said, why did these people show up? Of course, some showed up to hear the new preacher. Some showed up because it was their daily routine, or their Sunday routine. That's what we do on Sundays. But ultimately, he said, there's a lot of them who really love Jesus. They absolutely do. But he came down to this question. What did it cost them to show up? What risk was there in showing up? Or, what's the reverse? What risk was there in not showing up? There's no risk at all. If you show up or don't show up, and if see that large, you're just a face in the crowd. There's no accountability most of the time. And in fact, if you do show up every week, what's it going to cost you? I mean, think about it. In our culture today, what's it cost you to go to church every Sunday? You say, well, there are some people who don't like it. Yeah, there's some people who don't like it. So you don't get to go to dinner with the Hollywood elite. Congratulations. Cardi B is not going to be calling you anytime soon. I think you'll be okay. There's really no cost in most times, most circumstances in our culture. Now, if you strongly stand for your faith in a particular area, there can be a cost. It can cost you your business. It can cost you, a lot of different things. It can happen, but it's a social situation at this point. The question still becomes, though, are we chasing comfort or abandonment? Here's the observation David Platt makes. He says, let's say we took away the padded chairs. We turned off the air conditioning or the heat, depending on the season that it's in. We got rid of the PowerPoint, the music. We just got together, opened the Bible, and studied, and nothing else happened. Would that be enough for people? In these countries in Asia, they don't get to sing hymns when they get together, because if they're that loud, they get caught. They have to be quiet, and they just simply study God's Word and pray, and that's it. Would that be enough to keep people coming back? Oh, I think you'd show up for a week or two, because it'd be interesting, it'd be new, it'd be almost fun. But what about after year 1, year 2, year 3? Is God's Word enough? Well, it depends on if you're chasing comfort or total abandonment to Jesus. If Jesus is Lord, His Word will be enough. If Jesus is not Lord, then we have to have comforts with it. Only you can answer this question for yourself. Is Jesus Lord? Who is He in my life? And what is He calling me to do? Ultimately, all people are conformed to an image. I think of when we make cookies at the house. We have this big tub in our pantry of cookie cutters. And there's snowmen and stars and whatever, all kinds of shapes. And you roll out the dough and you just, whatever you want, you just cut it right out. Lots of different shapes. Really cool. A lot of fun. Kids have a good time making it when we do it. And it's enjoyable. But we also are conformed to an image. But we get a little bit of choice about what image we're going to be conformed to. And are we getting conformed to the American dream image? Or are we getting conformed to the image of Christ? That is a choice we have to make. And we need to honestly evaluate ourselves to figure it out. But I think maybe a better analogy is is going to race it. Coach, you'll appreciate this. Marathoners who train for marathons have what they call pace setters. Pace setters are the people who get in front of the runner to help set a certain pace. So let's say they're going to run a marathon at a 5-minute-a-mile pace. And so they get the guy in front of them, and he starts running. And for the first 5-6 miles, that guy keeps the 5-minute pace. And the guy who's running the marathon knows, I need to stay close to him, and I'll be on pace. Well, at some point, that guy peels off, and a new pace setter gets in there, also running at the 5-minute pace. Fresh set of legs. Keep it moving. Make sure that he doesn't slow down, because if he gets off pace, he'll never achieve his goal or his time. Never is there a point where the marathoner gets 20 feet behind the pace setter and says, I'm good, I'm fine, I'll make it up later. No, he knows I need to stay at pace with him constantly. I can't let him get too far ahead or I'll never get there. I think what happens in the Christian faith is Jesus is our pace setter and he gets out there and we're following behind him and he gets ahead pretty fast. And instead of us thinking, oh man, I got to catch up, we're like, oh, I'll get there later. Oh, that's interesting over there. Oh, that's cool over there. And we just let him get so far ahead, but we can see him in the distance. We'll catch up later. We got time anyway. And we make 1,000 excuses for why we're not trying to catch up. You remember what Jesus said? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now that's an impossibility without the blood of Jesus. We know that. But he's talking about the effort we put into it. If you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it's about the effort you're putting into your life. It's about if Jesus is Lord of your life or not. And that makes all the difference. So only you can answer the question, who is Jesus in my life and what is he calling me to do? Is he my pace setter? And am I trying to keep pace with him? You know, I think of a toddler in a crowd. If a toddler is following their parents, say in Bush State, 40,000 people, weaving their way through the crowd, and they get separated and the gap closes, does the toddler say, I'll see him later? No, they usually freeze or they start running and they always start screaming because they want to be close to mom and dad. They are desperate to be close to mom and dad. Anything else less than that will not work in a crowd like that. But when we get separated from Jesus, we don't feel that way. Oh, well, he forgives me. It's all good. Well, he does forgive you, but do you recall what that cost him? That's why we have communion every week, to remember what Jesus did to forgive you. We should not be so light about it. We shouldn't just brush it off as no big deal. It happens to everyone. Yeah, it does. But that is no reason to downplay it or excuse it. What are we chasing? Comfort or abandonment? And as Dan and Mom join me on stage, I want to maybe just ask one more question. Is what does it cost you to truly follow Jesus? What does it cost you to truly follow Jesus? You realize what it cost Jesus for you to follow him. It cost him his entire life. He sold out his entire life to preaching and teaching and helping and confronting and ultimately dying for us. He did that for us. If we give him anything less than that, he's not Lord. He might be friend. He might be companion. He might be comforter. He might be, leader of some areas. But anything less than that, he's not Lord. This morning, the good news is Jesus offers you the opportunity to make him Lord of your life. It begins with a decision where you believe, where you repent, where you're baptized, and then the journey begins from there. And so this morning, if you have a decision to make, if you need to make Jesus truly the Lord of your life, then you meet me down front as we stand and as we sing.